So I'm not quite done with my Korea vlogs just yet. I still do have like 2 more to upload, but I really wanted to get this FAQ out as quickly as possible because I've been getting a lot of questions. I kind of wanted to address those questions through this FAQ video so the answers are more accessible to everyone. Let's get to it, shall we? Let's go! So before I get into these questions, I kind of want to give a little bit of a background on my trip in case you're jumping in right on this video. You haven't really been following along my vlogs and all of that, which you can always catch up here. Or is it here? I don't know. Anyways, so I decided to take a solo travel trip last year, so 2021, in October, and I was in Korea from October all the way through the beginning of December. I am a US citizen and I was visiting on a short-term visa. What else? I was there just for fun. I think that's all you gotta know. So what were the logistics of like border entry and like what was needed to visit from the US? There's no strict restrictions for US citizens to visit Korea at this moment. For short-term visas, you can apply through KETA. Long-term visas is, you have to apply for it based off of the visa that you're going for. I don't really know what the process of that is like, so I would definitely recommend you check the embassy resources to get more information on that. Back to the KETA though, there are a list of countries that can apply through the KETA, so I'll link the website down below for your reference as well. For actual like entry requirements, all of that, it's very typical. You just need a negative PCR test. When I went, it was within 72 hours, but now I think they've reduced it down to within 48 hours. Did you need to be vaccinated to visit Korea? Being vaccinated is not a requirement to enter Korea. You just need a negative PCR test to show that you're COVID-free to enter Korea. I did hear that recently more businesses have been implementing vaccination records checks for people to like do dine-in or to visit the business. So that is something to be aware of. When I was there, they had just rolled out the with COVID plan from the government. So there were certain types of businesses that were already doing these kinds of checks, and plus with like restrictions past a certain hour, if you're dining with more than 4 people or whatever, then a certain number of those people needed to be vaccinated, etc. Of course, I was traveling alone, so a lot of times I was eating by myself, so that didn't really matter. So the next section is all about quarantine. I can't do an FAQ without talking about quarantine, right? Just in case you don't know, I do have a separate video all about like the whole immigrations customs process, so like right when you land at the airport, all of that as a walkthrough, as well as a actual government facility quarantine vlog. So make sure to check those out first if you see that I didn't answer any like particular questions here. So how was quarantine? So when I did my quarantine, it was still on the 14-day quarantine. Now it's since been reduced to 7 days, which is so lucky. Where are people going right now? Anyways, but 14 days, so 2 weeks in a hotel room by myself, no contact with anyone whatsoever. It actually was okay. So you might not know this about me, but I am quite the homebody, and I can go days at home without leaving my home. So being in a hotel room for 14 days really wasn't that bad. Plus, all the meals were provided for you at a very like set time, and I'm all about routines. So it was a very nice life. Actually, would I want to live it forever? No. But for 14 days, not terrible. Did you have to do the government facility quarantine, or could you like do an Airbnb instead? Yes, I did do the government facility quarantine. All short-term visitors are required to do the government facility quarantine. Only those who are visiting as a long-term resident or like a local national they have the option to do a self-quarantine. Basically, they choose to do those 7 days at home, but if their home is not like a suitable environment for quarantine, like they live with other people, they share bathroom, etc., then they can choose to get an Airbnb to do their self-quarantine at, or they can also choose to do their quarantine at the government facility. Everything for the government facility is out of pocket, so you have to pay for yourself regardless. For long-term residents and local nationals, it's a choice for them whether or not they want to go through the government facility or they want to find their own for a cheaper price. For short-term visitors like myself, I had to go to the government facility. There was no other exception for that. Did you get to choose at least which hotel and like what kind of room you got to stay in? No, I wish. You have no choice whatsoever where you're staying or where you're going. The moment that you get out of customs in Incheon airport, you're like escorted through this like line, and then they tell you to get on a bus where you don't even know where you're going, honestly, and then they drop you off at this hotel and they're like, okay, go through this process, you know, pay for your stay, and then the guy just gives you a key and then you like don't know your room until you get up there, basically. When you said you had to do 14 days of quarantine, how exactly was that calculated? What is considered day 14 and then you're done and you're out? Good question. That was the part that I was most confused and concerned about, and that's also why I didn't book my accommodations for like after getting out of quarantine until I was in quarantine. So the way that they calculate it is, it's easier to think of it as 14 nights. Now it'd be like 7 nights, but 14 nights. So if I counted the day that I arrived and got into the hotel as day 1, I technically left the hotel on day 15 in the morning. And the time that you are able to leave is the same for everyone. You had to pay for everything out of pocket. So how much was it? My total cost ended up being $1,420 USD for the entire stay. Of course, mind you that my stay was 14 days or 14 nights. Now it'll be cheaper. I think for their 7 days, they have a set pricing. So there's no deviation. This is like what to expect. Based off of what you've said so far about the process, it seems like there really is no time for you to like go off on your own when you get off the plane at Incheon, all the way until you get to your government facility like room. So when do you get to like get your local SIM card or local like get to exchange local currency? Hi, editing Amy here. So something about currency exchange that I forgot to mention was that you can technically exchange your local currency into Korean won at any international airport. You don't have to wait until you get to Seoul or get to Korea in order to do that. Most international airports have a currency exchange station. The only thing with those places is that the exchange rate is usually a little bit higher. Same with banks. So that's why I decided to bring USD cash to exchange locally instead, since I already had Korean won on hand. I don't use cash that much. Of course, you do need it for certain things like charging your T-money or, you know, the street stands. Those only take cash. So having some cash is definitely recommended, but I used card for the most part. And then for the SIM card, I ordered mine through Tracy. I had ordered my local SIM card before I left for Korea so that it arrived in my home in US, and then I had it on hand. It was activated the day that I landed in Korea, and all I had to do was like put it into my phone and it would work. So I'll link that below in the description box for more information. It was a little bit more expensive than picking it up in Korea, but to not have to worry about like when to get it during this whole process was definitely worth that money. How was it getting around Korea during COVID times? Was it any different than usual? Hello, it's me again. I didn't really like how I answered the question initially, so I'm going to try it again now. There wasn't too much different in getting around Korea because of COVID. You just see everyone wearing masks, really. One main difference was that the government implemented a like contact tracing method. So businesses that would require you to stay for a period of time, like restaurants, shops, etc., you have to scan a QR code or call a number to like signify that you are entering this establishment, so that if a potential case arises in that area, the government can contact you to let you know, to make sure that you know, hey, you might need to go get tested because you might have been in contact with someone who had COVID. So I didn't know that going in, and so that was a little bit confusing when I arrived in Korea, but once I got the hang of it, it was really easy to navigate. Aside from that, most businesses and places are operating as normal. Alright, so the next part is going to be some like general questions for, you know, solo traveling through Korea, my experience, stuff like that. How did you get around? I took public transportation for the most part. Subway was like my best friend. Sometimes I took buses. And then I also have Kakao Taxi on my phone, which is basically their like Uber or Lyft. And so I used that to call for taxis because that way I didn't have to like tell the driver where I wanted to go and then have to go through the trouble of like trying to communicate with broken Korean, because with the app I just put in the address that I want to go to and the driver like gets that through their device and everything is like set that way. So you mentioned that you didn't want to like talk to the taxi drivers. Was it hard to navigate with limited Korean proficiency? Like, how did you manage that? I don't know how to answer this question because I feel like I didn't manage, but somehow I'm alive, so yeah. I would recommend that you know your basic phrases, right? Like hello, thank you, how much is this? I am a foreigner. I said that so many times. Like 죄송해요, 저는 외국인이에요. But I think if you are going to be visiting Korea and you're staying in mostly the bigger metropolitan cities like Busan or Seoul, you're going to be just fine with like very limited knowledge. Most of the younger generation are pretty fluent in English, at least in understanding. They might not feel comfortable speaking it, but if they understand you, half the battle is already won, right? My proficiency level is like, okay, I can kind of get by with casual conversation, but if you like really dissect what I'm saying, it probably doesn't make sense and it's probably not what people would say, but I get the idea across, I think. I hope. I don't know. I didn't actually have to use my Korean too much. I only really needed to use it when I was like shopping or like buying food. A lot of the people that I met and like hung out with, I spoke to in English. So, ugh, too much talking, not enough water. No battery. How did you find things to do and like the places to go? Honestly, I kind of didn't have a big plan of what I wanted to do when I got to Korea. I had absolutely no idea what was available in Busan when I got to Busan, and then I spent, I think, a whole day just researching like things to do in Busan, things I should see in Busan, top 10 things to do in Busan. And then what I would do is I would bookmark things that I find interesting on Naver Maps and then kind of map out the areas or districts that I would want to go to. Another thing that I used to kind of find things to do was the app Day Trip. So on Day Trip, they categorize locations by area. So like if I was in Gangnam, you know, I can see these are the top hot places that, you know, either just opened up or people really like to go to for pictures, for dessert, for food, whatever it is. They usually have a wide range of like cafes, restaurants, sometimes even exhibits. Last time that I had traveled to Korea by myself, I planned almost like every hour of my day, and it wasn't until like the end of my trip that I realized, oh, there was so much that I could have done, and if I just had allowed myself to do whatever, I probably would have done it. But because I was so like stuck on this idea of sticking to a schedule, I didn't allow myself to experience anything outside of my comfort zone or outside of what I had already known. So that's why this trip, I really wanted to kind of go in with more of an open mind and just do whatever came up. Back to the question, how did I find things to do? Naver Maps, Instagram, day trip, internet, yeah. What was your favorite food in Korea? Guys, this is like so hard. So many people have already asked me since returning from my trip, like, oh, what was the best thing that you ate? What was your favorite food? Honestly, I don't know. I don't know. I would say, I posted this on my Instagram, but hot dog is my favorite like street food snack. I found this thing in Busan which is called murdok, which is legit just a really long stick of rice cake on a skewer that was like cooked in the odengang, like the fish cake soup. It's so simple, but I don't know what it is about it. It's so good. It's like savory on the outside, but the rice cake, and you chew it, it gets sweet. So those two are definitely my favorite street snacks. As for like an actual like dish that I really liked, it's really hard. I would have to say the most memorable meals that I had were my two set meals. One was like in Karasugi, I think. There was like this pork belly set lunch menu that was like $10 USD, and it was really good quality meat. I think it was probably one of the better quality meats that I had. And then the second one was in Busan, in Gwangali, when I got the fish, like the mackerel set menu dinner. But those were probably like my most memorable foods that I can think of at this moment. Yeah. You went cafe hopping so much during your trip. Did you have a favorite cafe? So I tried to go to different cafes during my trip. I rarely, if ever, went to a repeat cafe. Mostly just because there's so many cafes in Korea and all of them are different. It just didn't make sense to me that I would go to the same one more than once when down the street there was another one that I could check out. I didn't really have a favorite cafe, but I do have a few cafes that I would like highly recommend to people to visit. In Busan, where I was staying in Haeundae, it was really close to this little district called Haeridangye. One of my favorite cafes in that area was called Cafe Hito. That was one that I actually had recommended to one of my friends too, and she really enjoyed it. But the dessert is just really good. Their tea is really high quality. And the whole vibe of it was very like calm and serene type of like atmosphere, so it was really nice. My most like unique cafe experience was the Meerkat Cafe, and that was just so much fun. Like, I never thought that I would love meerkats so much, but I love meerkats so much. There were also a few cafes that I had visited, you know, that I didn't vlog that were really nice. Ikseondong has a lot of cafes. In Seoul, there's this chain called Cheongsudang. Very pretty, and the food is really good too, so would recommend that as well. And there's also like the 2D cafe. The desserts weren't as great, but it was definitely a very cool concept to kind of go to. But yeah. I'm taking a little break. I need sugar. I'm getting tired. Okay, we back. How much money did you spend while you were there? So I actually went into this trip with like this whole budget plan for myself, right? Because I'm not working, so I want to make sure I don't go broke. If I don't take into account the expenses that I had to maintain my life back home, like rent, my phone bill, etc., just the money that I purely spent in Korea, so not even counting my like flight tickets, what have you, I spent $4,360. My top 3 spend categories were, no surprise, food experiences. I clumped the hair salon, getting facials, tickets to get into exhibits, museums, etc., all of that into like experiences. And then my third category was shopping, and I had some high spend items while I was in Korea that were more unexpected, so I think that's why shopping like got bumped to the top. Story time. Day one. Hour one of getting out of quarantine, I was on the subway to go into Seoul, and it's like 8 a.m. in the morning, so it's like rush hour, so there's tons of people, right? And I had this huge suitcase with me. I was like standing, so I had the lever pulled out so that, you know, I could keep an eye on my suitcase and it wouldn't like roll away. People start like cramming into this train and start pushing, and then I get knocked over because somebody tripped and they landed on my suitcase. So I was still holding my suitcase while they landed on my suitcase, and I fell along with it. And then when I got up, I realized the handle, like the pull-out handle, had snapped. I couldn't put it back in. I couldn't do anything. It was stuck, it was bent, and it was like partially broken. I could see the metal cracked. I was like going to be traveling from place to place, so I needed to be able to like pull my luggage along. And so I was like, well great, now I have to get a new suitcase. So that cost me like $150 US. And fun fact, that suitcase also broke. Anyway, so out of this trip I got two broken suitcases. So you might be wondering like why housing isn't part of my top expenses, which brings us to our next question. Where did you stay while you were in Korea, and like how did you find the places that you stayed at? I was debating how to talk about this because honestly I don't really know the legalities of things, but I stayed at guest houses / hostels for the most part during my stay in Korea. So during my last trip to Korea, I stayed at a hostel that I had found through this website called hostelworld.com. But when I was looking at it this time around, a lot of the hostel options weren't available anymore, and I think a lot of them had to close down because of the pandemic and the lack of tourists, etc. A lot of the places were actually double listed on booking.com, which is where I ended up booking a lot of my accommodations. And the reason why housing wasn't a part of my top expenses is because when I was in Busan, my stay was actually comped. I was staying at this language exchange cafe, so I worked like 6 to 8 hours a week in exchange for board. It was a really fun experience actually, and it didn't require much work. I literally was just there to like talk to local Koreans and then, you know, help them with the pronunciation. And that's also how I met a lot of my friends actually, was either the students that were there or the other volunteers. So that was a really good way as a solo traveler to kind of make connections, which is something I'll talk about later on because I think there's another question about that as well. How I found the opportunity to work at the language exchange cafe, I'll link that down below. There's a lot of different sites to use. There's like HelpX, like Workaway. Why did you travel to Korea again? I mentioned this briefly in my life announcement video, but going to Korea has always been a goal of mine, like to go for a really long period of time. But it's mostly because I visited Korea twice before, but they were all only for like a week each time. And every single time that I came back from those trips, I would feel so like sad, you know. I'd be like, oh, there's still so much I want to see. There's still so much I want to do there. I really like had this like yearning to go back. And so I was like, you know what? This is the time for me to do it. If I love it so much, I should just try it out, see if I really do love Korea. It was also a way for me to explore whether or not I want to consider moving there long term. So that's kind of why I decided to take this trip. You mentioned that you had traveled to Korea before. What is your favorite part about solo traveling in a different country? I can't speak in a general sense about this because I've actually only solo traveled in Korea. So both times that I've done solo travel trips, they were both in Korea. What I do love about solo traveling is the freedom. Like, you get to decide exactly what you want to do. There is no other considerations that you have to take in aside from, you know, like, is the place that you want to go to actually open, that kind of thing. It's a time for you to like actually embrace what you want. It's a very good time for self-exploration, self-discovery, and to kind of build up that sense of self as well. So that's something that I really appreciate about solo traveling. Okay guys, we're almost done, I swear! I swear! Did you get lonely solo traveling through a different country? I think the first time that I solo traveled through Korea, I definitely felt the loneliness. Like on day 3 or day 4, I was like, oh my god, I need human contact, I can't do this anymore. But when I started feeling that way, I like decided, you know, I'm gonna go to language exchange meetup, meet some other people who want to learn English, like locals, also other foreigners who might be going to like try to learn Korean. I do enjoy them from time to time because it kind of gives you the opportunity to meet people. Another like way that I mentioned before is like being in a hostel is like a natural environment for you to meet people, but because there weren't that many tourists to begin with, I didn't really get to meet people through the hostels or guest houses aside from the one where I was staying at for the workaway. But I also met a lot of other people and locals to hang out with. So a few of those ways that I met people was through like Hello Talk. Hello Talk is this language exchange app. Through there, I was able to post like, oh, I'm in Busan, I would love to hang out with other people who would be willing to, you know, do some cultural exchange or language exchange, that kind of thing. People reach out, you kind of talk to make sure they're not weird, and then you can choose to like meet up at your own risk. I mentioned meetup.com was a good way to meet people without being like one-to-one, is more like a group setting, so that's always like safer, right? Especially as a like solo woman, it's like you kind of have to be aware of those kinds of things. Another app that I had used to meet people was Bumble BFF. But yeah, that's kind of how I met friends and had people to hang out with and eat with, because that's also like one of the struggles of being a solo traveler. Last question! Where are you now and what's next? So as you can see, I am home. Home is California for me. Right now, I don't really have any plans to travel too much for the next few months. I do want to travel more this year. My next destination that I would want to travel to is actually Taiwan, which is where my parents are from. I never actually really explored Taiwan as an adult by myself. I always go with my family, so I just get, you know, shuffled around from like relative to relative, like, oh, this is an uncle that you met when you were like 5 years old, you probably don't remember them, but he's your uncle, that kind of deal. So that's kind of what's on the plate next in terms of travel. For my life in general, we don't know yet. I still do really love making these videos. I think now that I'm home and I'm wrapping up my Korea content, is definitely a turning point for me in considering like what else I can do with this channel. And I do have a few like more vlogs of my like daily life and stuff like that to show you guys, but yeah, it's still kind of all up in the air. So if you have any suggestions on what you want to see from me, if you enjoyed this kind of FAQ, if you want to know more about Korea and like my previous experiences, anything, feel free to comment down below and let me know. My DM is also always open on Instagram, so feel free to message me there. I think that's all of the questions I had compiled for this video. Thanks for sitting down and hanging out with me today. I'll see you guys next week. Bye! Dude, I don't know why I decided to use my Mongdongyi for my interview. I didn't even like set a pretense for this format, but whatever. I hope you enjoyed that randomness.